All right, welcome. Today we are diving deep into one of the most influential and honestly complex ideas in all of Western thought, John Calvin's doctrine of salvation. And we're going to do it by going straight to the source, his Institutes of the Christian Religion, to really see how he builds this incredible case, piece by piece.
So let's jump right in with the central question, the big problem that Calvin's entire theology is trying to solve. And it's this huge paradox that sits right at the very heart of the divine. How in the world can God be both a loving father and a wrathful judge?
Yeah, to even begin to understand Calvin's answer, we first have to really get our heads around these two kind of conflicting truths that he lays out. They describe God's relationship with us, with humanity, and it's a tension that just screams for a resolution. And this right here, this lays out the dilemma so clearly. On the one hand, Calvin says God has this pure, unchangeable love for us. I mean, he created us for life. But on the other hand, God's perfect righteousness means he absolutely despises the sin that's in us. Calvin literally calls this an irreconcilable disagreement. Think about that. God loves the person he made, but he hates what they've become. So you have to ask, how can that gap ever be bridged? Well, to figure that out, we first have to look at our side of that massive canyon. Okay, so that brings us to the other side of the problem, right? The human side. What is our actual condition, if we don't have some kind of divine intervention? Wow. Yeah, Calvin does not pull any punches. He paints an incredibly stark picture here. He's not saying humanity is just a little bit flawed or, needs a little self-improvement. No. In his view, we are totally cut off from God, we're legally condemned, and we are completely and utterly helpless before a perfectly just judge.
And because God is this righteous judge, he can't just ignore the crime. He can't just sweep broken laws under the cosmic rug. His own character, his perfect justice, demands that a payment be made. A debt has to be settled. A satisfaction is required.
So here's the billion-dollar question. How can this cosmic legal problem possibly be solved? How do you satisfy the demands of a perfect judge while also saving the guilty party? For Calvin, the answer is found 100% in the life and death of Jesus Christ. You see, for Calvin, the payment wasn't just one single event on the cross. It was the entire course of Christ's life. From the moment he was born, through every single action, he lived in perfect obedience to God's law. This whole life of perfect righteousness, that was the payment. It was a debt humanity owed but could never, ever pay for itself.
But to fully cancel our condemnation, Christ's death had to be more than just, a tragic end to a good life. Calvin frames it almost like a courtroom drama. It's a legal transaction. To save us from judgment, Christ had to literally step into that cosmic courtroom and take on the role of a guilty criminal.
And this slide, this just illustrates the heart of the whole idea so perfectly. It's what theologians call substitutionary atonement. Now, this was a revolutionary idea, suggesting that salvation wasn't something you earned through rituals, but it was a legal status change. Just follow the flow here. Our sin and the curse that comes with it, it's legally transferred onto Christ. He takes our guilty verdict. And then, in return, his perfect purity and righteousness are legally transferred to us. It's like we are literally clothed in his innocence.
This verse from Galatians, this was a key piece of the puzzle for Calvin. The method of death, crucifixion, was absolutely crucial. Why? Because according to the Old Testament law, anyone who hangs on a tree is considered accursed by God. So by being crucified, Christ didn't just die. He literally, legally took the full curse of the law upon himself.
But for Calvin, the price was even higher. It went deeper than just physical suffering and legal condemnation. To truly pay the full cost of sin, Christ had to endure a kind of spiritual torment that, honestly, is often overlooked or completely misunderstood.
And that brings us to one of the most debated and frankly confusing phrases in the entire Apostles' Creed. What in the world does it mean when it says Christ descended into hell? Calvin had a very specific and very non-literal take on this.
Okay, so first, let's look at what he says it's not. He completely rejects the idea that this was some kind of literal journey to an underworld place, like limbo, to go free the Old Testament saints. And he also says it's not just a fancy poetic way of saying he was buried. For Calvin, that would make no sense. It would be a pointless repetition in a creed where every single word matters.
So here's the key. For Calvin, hell wasn't a place Christ went to after he died. It was a spiritual state he experienced while he was dying. It was the unimaginable agony of his soul as he bore the full, concentrated weight of God's righteous anger against all of human sin.
It was the feeling of being utterly condemned and abandoned by the Father.
And that cry from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" in Calvin's view, that is the ultimate expression of that descent into hell. This wasn't just about the physical pain of the nails. This was the absolute peak of that spiritual torment, the experience of divine abandonment. That was the true price of sin.
So, what happens now? With the full price paid, physical, legal, and spiritual, the whole story takes a dramatic turn. It shifts from penalty to victory. The payment of that massive debt secures a real, concrete hope for believers.
You can think of Christ's death and resurrection as two sides of the very same coin. His death is kind of the negative action. It cancels the debt, it wipes out sin, it extinguishes the power of death. But then his resurrection, that's the positive action. It restores righteousness, it raises up new life, and it declares the final, ultimate victory.
And his work doesn't even stop there. By ascending to heaven, Calvin says Christ accomplished three amazing things that are still happening right now. First, he opened a way for us, for humanity, to come into God's presence. Second, he acts as our permanent advocate, almost like our defense attorney, constantly before the Father. And third, from his position of ultimate authority, he pours out his power, his Spirit, to give us real spiritual life.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? For Calvin, the system is just perfectly complete. Every single component of salvation, every spiritual need a person could possibly have, is found in one person and one person alone. This summary from Calvin himself is just incredible. It's almost like a spiritual checklist. You need redemption? Look to his suffering. You need acquittal from guilt? You look to his condemnation. You need remission of the curse? You find it in his cross. New life, an inheritance, security, it's all there. Every single need is met by a specific part of Christ's work. In Calvin's view, there is absolutely no reason to look anywhere else.
And that's the essence of Calvin's doctrine. It's a closed loop, a totally complete system of redemption centered entirely on Christ, and it's designed to leave the believer with no doubts and no other options. Because if one person contains every single answer, what questions are even left to ask?